So I would like to share with you some of the key findings from a large-scale research project that I conducted over the last 5 years. And so this project is called TREND, and it stands for Trade and Environment Dataset, because I did create a pretty large dataset of all the environmental provision included in any of the more than 700 trade agreements concluded around the world since 1947. So in this presentation, I will not really go into the specifics of USMCA or any other trade agreement for that matter. Instead, I will offer a bird's-eye view to put USMCA into perspective of this broader context of all the other trade agreements and their respective environmental provision. And I think this is useful because if we want to anticipate what might be the future impact of USMCA, I think we need to look backward at what were the impacts of similar trade agreements with similar environmental provision. Next slide, please. Yes. So this project started from the realization that there is a proliferation of trade agreements. As I mentioned earlier, more than 700 of them. Actually, if you look at the WTO website, you'll see fewer trade agreements. This is because not all of them were notified to the WTO. So here you have a more complete picture of all the trade agreements. And as you can see, actually, the number of trade agreements concluded every year peaked in the mid 90s, actually. And there's been a decline since the mid 90s. But the depth of each of those trade agreements is increasing, meaning that every new trade agreement tends to include and address an increasing number of issues and also go deeper in each of those different issues. And to me, as a social scientist, each of those trade agreements is a laboratory, basically, where environmental provision are being experimented and from which we can learn, and we can learn something. And I think we actually need to learn something because we hear different things related to the environment and trade. We hear groups saying that we should oppose to the conclusion of new trade agreement in the name of environmental protection. And we also hear the opposite claim that actually those trade agreements help to improve environmental protection. So there is clearly an abundance of opinions, but I felt, at least when I started this project, that there was a shortage of empirical evidence. So to find out, I identified close to 300 different types of environmental provision. Here, what you have on this slide, you have 10 broad categories of environmental provision, but keep in mind that within each of those categories, there's on average 30 different, more specific types of environmental provision. So for example, the first category here, you have environmental law principles. So under this broad category, you have things like the precautionary principle, the prevention principle, the polluter pay principle, the common but shared responsibility principle, and so on. The other main categories include, ensuring a high level of environmental protection. Third, more specific environmental commitment on specific issue areas like biodiversity, climate, desertification, forestry, fisheries, and so on. The fourth category is safeguards for the regulatory space of member states. Those are mainly exceptions to trade commitments. Then you have provision favoring transparency and public participation. There's quite a wide diversity of provision favoring transparency and public participation. Then you have a set of provision regarding cooperation, including scientific cooperation, but also policy cooperation. Then there's a seventh category on capacity building, and that includes things like tech transfer, financial assistance, mainly targeting developing countries, but not always. The eighth category is ensuring policy coherence, not only between trade and environment, but also between the environment and gender, or indigenous issues, or urban planning, agriculture, health, and so on. The ninth one is reference to multilateral environmental agreements, because trade agreements very often will refer to multilateral environmental agreements. They will ask their parties to ratify them, or to implement them, or they will provide that in case of inconsistency between a trade agreement or an environmental agreement, that the environmental agreement should prevail. And the last category regards dispute resolution. So those are very broad categories, and as I said, under each of those categories, I identified and detail very specific types of environmental provision. Actually, there's a code book, more than 100 pages, detailing specific criteria for each of those different types. And then I hired a team of research assistants. Most of them were trained lawyers, and they worked for several months to read those 730 different trade agreements, from the very first line to the very last line. And keep in mind that some of them have more than, sometimes several hundreds pages, but sometimes more than 1,000 pages, because environmental provision can be found basically everywhere in a trade agreement, not only in a chapter specifically devoted to the environment, but can be found basically everywhere. So they had to read the entire trade agreement to identify every provision and to classify them. And not only that, but every trade agreement was read at least twice, if not 3 different types, to make sure that the data set was consistent and reliable. So on this slide, you're not supposed to read anything from this slide, actually. It's just to give you a feeling of what the data set looked like. So basically you have on the columns, you have the 730 different trade agreements, and then you have all the different, on the rows, and then on the columns, you have all the 280 different environmental provision. So this is the data set that I use for my research, but I understand very well that Excel spreadsheet like that people can freely download. It's publicly available, but it's not super user-friendly for a lot of stakeholders. So I partner with the German Development Institute to create this interactive website where people can go. It's very interactive. You can compare different countries, different trade agreements. You can zoom in, zoom out, change the time period, and also see the expression of different example of the same environmental provision. So, for example, the precautionary principle. This principle could be expressed in various ways. And so I think it is interesting, and I hope useful perhaps for trade negotiators themselves to have access to a data set like this that is freely available and user-friendly, so that it can see different expression of this more or less the same norm, the same principle, or the same rule or obligation. And also I hope that trade negotiators could basically borrow good ideas and get inspiration, especially from little known trade agreements. I mean, there's some trade agreements are very well known, but there's also little known trade agreements that include very interesting provision regarding environmental protection. From this data set, I would like to share with you 4 main takeaway findings. The first one regards NAFTA. NAFTA and its North American Agreement on Environmental Cooperation. Those 2 agreements together were groundbreaking agreements in the early 90s. It's important at this stage to clarify that for the purpose of the data set, I grouped together the trade agreement with their side agreement. So if a trade agreement and an environmental agreement were concluded on the same day by the same parties, I would consider them for the purpose of this data set as a single package, basically, even though technically speaking, they are 2 separate agreements. I was saying that the NAFTA and the North American Agreement on Environmental Cooperation were groundbreaking. And one way in which you can see this, it's in this bar chart. What you have here is the number of novelties for the most innovative trade agreements. So basically, for all the 280 different environmental provision of my data set, I looked where and when they first appeared in the global trade system. And clearly, by far, the most innovative, or the agreement with the highest number of novelties was NAFTA with its side agreement again. Some European agreements are also interesting and included a number of innovation. By the way, some environmental agreements, some trade agreements concluded by the European Commission, even before the conclusion of the UNFCCC, so before 1992, already mentioned climate change. So as far as I know, I think the first international treaties to mention climate change were actually trade agreement. I think some of them, even at the end of the 80s, were mentioning global warming back then. So all this to say that the European Union is also quite innovative in some of its trade agreements, but by far the most innovative agreement was NAFTA, and especially its side agreement. So NAFTA was not only groundbreaking when you compare it with earlier trade agreements, but also it set something in motion for the entire trade system. So the red line that you see here, this is the average number of environmental provision included in all the trade agreements for a given year. And as you can see, until NAFTA was concluded, a lot of the average was pretty low. Also, most trade agreements back then didn't include anything on the environment. But soon after the conclusion of NAFTA, we have this Cambrian explosion, basically, where we have more and more environmental provision that are more diverse, but also increasing in number, in average, in trade agreements. You can see this in various ways. For example, what you have here is all the trade agreements concluded by Canada. They are displayed in chronological order, and you have them on the horizontal axis. You have the number of environmental provision. And you can see clearly that there's something, that there's a before NAFTA and an after NAFTA. By the way, trade agreements do include free trade agreements, but I include also sectoral agreements. So some of those agreements are not free trade agreements. It includes, for example, the Auto Pact and other sectoral trade agreements. But you can clearly see that there's a before and after NAFTA. This is the case for Canada, but it's also the case, for example, in the next slide for Mexico. There's also a before and after NAFTA. So if you look again, chronological order, before NAFTA, very little on the environment. After NAFTA, it became a standard practice, not only for Canada, Mexico, and the US, but for an increasing number of countries. Another way of seeing this diffusion of environmental provision in a trade system is with a network analysis like this one. So what you have here is a representation basically of the trade agreements that include provision regarding public participation. And this is in 1995, and back then there was only one trade agreement, including, once again, the side agreement, one trade agreement with a provision regarding public participation in environmental lawmaking, environmental policymaking, and that was NAFTA and its side agreement. So this is the representation of NAFTA that you have here. Each dot is different countries, and you have the line connecting them representing NAFTA. That was in 1995. But if we go 5 years later, in 2000, you can see that the network is basically expanding. And in 2005, it's expanding again. It's growing basically out of NAFTA. We have this contagion effect, basically. And it's not only NAFTA countries that are promoting those norms, those provision in their own trade agreements with third parties, but then it becomes other countries outside of North America that are reproducing, diffusing those provision elsewhere. So this is for 2010, and here in 2015, clearly we see this diffusion. And now, basically, it is expected in a modern trade agreement to include provision on public participation. All this to say that NAFTA and its side agreement were groundbreaking.